It's now 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time and the session will begin. So I'll start with a brief introduction. Welcome to the Canadian Institute of Forestry's National Electronic Lecture Program. My name is Tanisha Rajput and I'll be hosting today's session. Today is Wednesday, November 27, 2024, and this is the fourth session in the e-lecture series featuring graduate student research. For today's session, we are pleased to have Danique Boissonneault, who will give a presentation titled Effects of Oil Sands Disturbances on Forest Structure and the Composition Along Alberta's Boreal Forest Edges. To kick things off, Danique Boissonneault is a master's student in the Applied Conservation Ecology Lab at the University of Alberta, working under Dr. Scott Nelson's supervision. Danique's research aims to evaluate forest structure, composition, and mortality rates by footprint type and distance to disturbances in the Athabasca oil sands region. With that, I will now pass it to Danique.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I appreciate that. So thank you all for having me today and for being here during this webinar. As Tanisha mentioned, the title of my project is Effects of Oil Sands Disturbances on Tree Structure and Composition Along Alberta's Boreal Forest Edges. Okay, so what you can expect from this presentation today is a brief introduction into Alberta's oil sands and kind of the topic of this field, my research objectives, methods, some preliminary results, and of course, project significance. So as I said, to start off, I'd like to just do a brief introduction into Alberta's oil sands and their associated disturbances. So as you can see on the map on the left, there are three main areas in Alberta's oil sands regions. So there's the Peace River, the Athabasca, and Cold Lake regions. The Athabasca is the largest, spanning over an area of approximately 93,000 kilometers squared. And so these areas are rich in oil sands, of course, which consists of a mix of sand, clay, water, and bitumen. So bitumen is a highly viscous form of crude oil, which requires some sort of heating to get it flowing and to allow us to get it extracted. So I've heard it's even more viscous than peanut butter. There are two primary extraction methods. First, open pit mining, used for deposits less than 75 meters deep, as seen on the right-hand side. So this is kind of your classic oil sands image if you think about Fort Mac, in my opinion. Next, we have in situ recovery method, which utilizes steam or a combination of steam and solvents to extract bitumen from deeper reservoirs, so greater than 75 meters in depth, as seen in this figure created by Suncor. So they pump solvents or steam and solvents into the ground, and then that heats up the bitumen, which can then be extracted. So for this project, we're focusing on land disturbances from in situ oil extraction. So in situ extraction minimizes surface mining, but it still causes significant land impacts. So because it requires infrastructure development, such as roads for access and transportation, well pads for drilling and extraction operations, and seismic lines for exploration and mapping the subsurface resource. So seismic lines can be seen in this image that I took near Fort Mac, and it had just snowed, so you can really see the seismic lines kind of popping out at you. So these features, as you can see in the image, really dissect the forest in the oil sands region, which breaks up continuous boreal forests and increases the amount of forest edges. So in 2001, it was estimated that the total length of seismic lines alone in Alberta was about 1.5 to 1.8 million kilometers. So if you double that, because of course the linear feature has two sides, so if you double that, that's how much a forest edge there is in Alberta. So it's quite extensive. Okay, so talking about forest edges, life at the edge, what are edge effects? So edge effects are at this unique transition zone where two ecosystems meet. As you can see in this figure here, I tried to depict a disturbance, so a clear-cut area, and then right next to it, a forest. So this is what I mean by this unique transition zone. So at the edge, there's greater sunlight exposure, greater vulnerability to wind damage and blowdowns, which alters the microclimate, so changes the humidity levels, temperature, etc. This also brings changes to vegetation. So usually there's a dense understory growth with edge-tolerant species replacing the interior forest specialist at the edge. And this brings upon certain wildlife impacts. For example, some potential changes in habitat for cavity nesting birds, for example. So edge effects have been categorized into two different types of responses, which Harper et al. In 2005 did a great job at doing. So just kind of a broad stroke over this, primary responses are basically a direct change in canopy structure. And then we have these secondary responses, so that change in understory structure and composition. What I want you to get out of this diagram here is in the box titled edge development. There's an effect called the ceiling effect. So this is when there's a development of dense vegetation at the maintained edges, which I'll be talking about in a second. Okay, so past researchers have shown that edge effects are proportional to the width of their disturbances. Pardon me, that certain edge effects are proportional to the width of their disturbances. However, some have also shown that the width of the disturbances doesn't actually matter, especially when looking at abiotic metrics in the secondary responses. In addition to this, in the past, many have focused on both primary and secondary responses while using non-continuous transects. And what I mean by this is, if you look at the first figure here from Chen et al. In 1992, you can see that they had 7 plots along a 270-meter transect line going into the interior forest. So this is just showing that there's an increased number of dead trees at the edge versus the interior, which is great. This, by the way, was done in an old growth Douglas fir forest in Oregon, so very different than what I'm researching. But I just wanted to showcase that many past researchers have done plots along a transect instead of doing a continuous transect to highlight the variability in the mature forest. So I think that this is a pretty significant knowledge gap, which we're going to try to address. And of course, Jackson et al. In 2023 did a very similar project to mine. So they went from 0 meters to a 50-meter interior forest. And this is also just to showcase that they also did 7 plots along the transect line instead of a continuous transect. This brings me to my research questions. So I have 2 main research questions, which will be broken up into 2 chapters for my master's. The first one being, does footprint type, so gap size, and orientation influence tree structure and composition in adjacent forests? So to answer this question, I'll be looking at this edge ceiling effect, which I mentioned previously. And my prediction is that there's going to be a greater density of trees at the edge versus the interior forest. And we're also going to look at edge recruitment. So my prediction is that there's going to be smaller trees at the edge versus the interior forest. For my second chapter, I'm going to look at the question, does gap size and orientation influence the proportion of large snags, which serve as potential habitat for cavity nesting birds, such as the pileated woodpecker in the adjacent forest? So I'll be looking at this size-dependent mortality hypothesis or prediction. So our prediction is there'd be an increased mortality along edges, especially for these large trees. Okay, so I touched on this, the pileated woodpecker, so cavity nesting birds. So pileated woodpeckers are a type of cavity nesting bird that live in the Boreal forest, and they have a preference for mature forest stands with large dead trees for nesting and roosting. So they create these very large cavities that are used by other forest dwellers after they're done with it. So why are we focusing on pileated woodpeckers? Well, in 2022, Canada's federal government introduced changes in regulations in the migratory birds regulation. And these new changes prohibit the damage, disturbance, or removal of migratory birds' nests when there is a possibility that the nest is still inhabited. So the waiting period for pileated woodpeckers specifically is 36 months before they can even, the proponent can even apply for a permit to disturb the area. So this is why that we're thinking this is a great opportunity to include this species when we're looking at these dead snags for my project. Okay, moving on to my study area and study design. My plots were situated between the northwest side of Lac La Biche all the way to Cold Lake, Alberta. So for those of you who are not familiar with the area, it's about 3 hours northeast of Edmonton, where I'm currently situated. And I had 20 sites that were adjacent to conventional seismic lines and 20 sites that were adjacent to abandoned well pads. So I had 5 in each cardinal direction, which I'll get into in a second. And we use a stratified design, so I site selected for only upland boreal forest stands. So at each site, I completed a continuous 100-meter belt transect, and I surveyed all seedlings and shrubs in a 2-meter wide belt. Then I surveyed all saplings within a 5-meter wide belt. For this project specifically, we characterize saplings as trees with a DBH between 1 and 5 centimeter. And then I surveyed all large trees, which I categorized as a tree with a DBH of 5 centimeter or greater along a 10-meter wide belt. I also took canopy cover measurements with a densiometer, and I did a coarse woody debris line transect at each site. And we took a composite soil sample at each site to account for site variability within my models. So I spoke about this orientation variable, and I just wanted to touch on this a little bit. So what I mean by orientation is, so let's take this well pad, for example. On the north side of the well pad, this adjacent forest edge would be south facing. So that's what I mean. If I'm speaking about south facing edges, that's what I mean by that. And same for seismic lines. Okay, so other variables that I wanted to touch on is this distance variable. So 0 meters being the edge of the forest, and then 100 meters being the interior forest of where my transect ended. For this edge ceiling effect that I will be modeling for, I had to bin my distances to create or to calculate density. So I just wanted to mention that for this specific model, I used 80 meters to 100 meters as my reference. So those were segmented between in 20-meter bins. Then I have disturbance type. So I have 2 disturbances for this project: abandoned well pads and conventional seismic lines. Then I have DBH, so diameter breast height, for all the large trees that I sampled. And I have the age of the edge, which is the years since the disturbance establishment. So you can think of this as like, how many years has it been since the well pad or seismic line has been cut? From my composite soil sample, I brought in the percent sand and percent silt into my models. And of course, tree status, so if the tree was dead or alive. So to get into some preliminary results for this edge ceiling effect, I use a generalized linear mixed effect model with random effective site ID, and I use the gamma family and link log. Density was my response variable, as I mentioned. And I tested different models, as you can see here. And the most parsimonious one was model DD, which had an interaction term between orientation and distance. And then I also had DBH and disturbance type. So I did not have age of edge or soil in this model, which was the most parsimonious. So I'm not going to spend too much time going over the output here, but I'd like to show you the results from this model in a marginal effects plot, as seen here. So it's pretty interesting that you can really see this potential edge effect in the 0 to 20 meter bin distance compared to the others, which is a great sign. It's really interesting to me that there is no difference between, or no significant difference between well pads and seismic lines. And yeah, I'm excited to dive into this a bit further. Now for this edge recruitment effect that I touched on previously. Once again, I used a GLMM with family, the Gaussian family, link with identity, and the same random effect, so site ID. For here, I won't spend too much time on the interpretation either, but the most parsimonious model was with this interaction, once again, with distance and orientation. So here I will show you the, just visually here. So for all orientations except south, these results complement my prediction that there are smaller trees at the edge versus the interior. I'm still looking into why this is happening, and I'm really curious, and perhaps some people might have some thoughts as to why the south-facing plot is going the opposite way of what we predicted. But yeah, I'm excited to look into this further. Now for the size-dependent mortality hypothesis. Pardon me, the most parsimonious model was with this interaction between distance, DBH, and orientation. And I still had the rest of my variables in there, which was really interesting. I'm just going to skip over this and go straight to my graphs here. So after looking at the model output and visualizing the results, we can see that overall trees in the west facing orientation have more variation when it comes to mortality compared to the other disturbances. And also we can see that for trees in the west orientations, larger trees, so with this DBH in the blue here, have a reduced mortality risk of mortality as you go further into the forest. And the opposite when looking at smaller trees, so the DBH like at around 10. So this is really interesting. And then those trees at the 20 dBH mark, it's pretty even Steven. So once again, I'm really excited to look into this a bit further. And I think these are really good preliminary results to kind of start at looking at these structural effects. So my next steps would be to look at my coarse woody debris data to kind of bring in more of a temporal aspect when looking at what has happened in the past in terms of snags being blown down near the edge versus the interior. Once again, looking at snags and specifically snags with the DBH of around 20 or greater, which is what pileated woodpeckers prefer in the boreal forest here. And of course, cavities. And just a sneak peek into cavities here. So another variable that I was looking at during fieldwork this year was we noted in our data sheets every time we saw a potential cavity, a cavity that had the potential to be from a pileated woodpecker, which was habited or non-inhabited. And so this is what the data came out as. This is just a simple count of trees with cavities along all my transects for seismic lines and well pads. In the east, you can see a bit more on seismic lines. And then in the west, it's interesting that there's not as many as in the east, but yeah, I'm really excited to look further into this and see what we can get out of it. Okay, now for project significance. This project will help determine the maintenance or loss of potential habitat for boreal forest dwellers, particularly cavity nesting birds, as I mentioned. It will also help determine the scale of responses, so hopefully get an edge distance that can help guide management practices and landscape assessments of fragmentation and edge effects, and also help determine recovery dynamics of edges over time. So bringing in that coarse woody debris data will help me get to see how temporary these effects are potentially, and if there are any lagged effects in the forest. So I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge and thank my field assistants, Charlotte McWilliams in 2023 and Kira Henry in 2024, and my funders. And here are my references. And thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Danique. That was a great presentation. Before we proceed to the question and answers, let's take a quick moment to fill out a survey. So that should show up on your screen in just a moment. All right. So there are 2 questions. You may need to scroll down to see the second question. So if you could quickly fill that out, that would be greatly appreciated. All right. So in the meantime, we can hop on to questions. So there is a question by Sherry. She asks, waterfowl was a major concern for the migratory bird disturbances for the nests, and would it be species like blue heron, and whether you see a link to other wildlife, which would include the water ecosystems and the draining of the water body of McLean Fen?
That's a great question. I think for the sites that I'm currently looking at, we're not necessarily like near wetlands or anything. I really picked like upland boreal forest ecosystems. But that's a really great question. I think that would be a great topic for another research project.
Perfect. Thanks, Danique. And then Robert's asking, were the cavities primarily in balsam poplar with heart rot?
That's a great question. Yes, but you know what? There was a bit of a mix, mostly in balsam poplar with heart rot, as you said. But in certain of our sites, especially in that interior forest where it started to be more of a mixed wood forest, we did see some in a lot of like dead white spruce snags, which was really interesting. Yeah, great question.
Okay, perfect. There's another question in the chat. I think you might have already answered, but I'm just gonna say it out loud anyways. So Sherry says again, thanks again, and appreciate your study. And did you do any research during the winter months, as deadfall is also part of the ecosystem?
Yeah, unfortunately not. It wasn't in my budget for this project, unfortunately. I believe that, so I did permanently tag all the large trees in my study. So I think it'd be really cool in a few years to do the same study and at different times of the year. Yeah, that's a great comment.
All right, one moment. Did you assess moisture conditions at your site, and ESW will impact tree growth?
Yeah, so for each of the orientation, in my first year in 2023, we did have some abiotic sensors to assess humidity levels, and even I had some soil moisture, like Tomsat sensors in the forest. Unfortunately, we didn't account for orientation in my first year, so I couldn't use most of my sites in 2023. We did have an undergraduate student in our lab that did look at this, and she's still working on her study, so I'm not too sure what the conditions are. But we did, like, there are some previous studies that have shown in the past that these abiotic measurements do change, like for especially like south and east, I think are similar to or both similar to each other compared to north and west. I could be mistaken on that, but yeah, it's a great comment, and I wish I did have that data to add to my models, but unfortunately it just didn't work out for the rest of my master's.
Excellent. Also, the south trend being different for small trees is consistent with expectations for light/heat differences on well pads. Would be very interesting. It holds true on a narrow east-west line. Perhaps differences in browsing as well as impacting establishment. Did you measure light heat?
Yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you. That's kind of what I'm thinking as well. Did you measure light and heat? So as I just mentioned, yeah, I tried to put out some abiotic sensors my first year, but didn't work out for the second. We just didn't have enough time and money to do so. But we do have an undergrad student looking at these effects in the same plots. So hopefully something comes out of that. Thank you.
Excellent. The boreal forest is a very complex ecosystem. Will you be adding plants such as grasses, flowers, and berries, which do pioneer a disturbed area?
So for my study specifically, I wanted to simply look at mature forest structure. Pardon me. As you saw in my presentation, I did survey all seedlings, saplings, and shrubs. So I'm hoping to bring in that composition effect into my project as well, but not so much for grasses and flowers. Sorry. But for shrubs, we did sample like all cranberries and beech hazelnut and so forth. So, so yeah, that's a really good comment. Thank you.
Excellent. And Robert's asking, do you have any observations regarding the shift to narrow seismic cut lines, less than 2.5 meters in the early 2000s?
Yeah, good question. Just from speaking to people in the field that are doing research on low impact seismic lines, so these are the narrow seismic lines that you're talking about, compared to the conventional seismic lines, we do see kind of a difference, like a bit less impact, but it depends what you're studying, right? So for me, for example, on conventional seismic lines, that's kind of all I'm looking at is really that gap size and orientation compared to bigger disturbances. There are some people doing some research on regeneration on low impact seismic lines. So I recommend kind of reading those. Pardon me.
Excellent. These are some wonderful questions. Danique, do you want to mention your email address in case people have more questions? Or you can even type it in the chat, whatever is easier.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I can type it in the chat here.
Perfect. And while you do that, I can read out the next question. Lots of engagement today. That's great. So Sherry's asking, how about drought does, okay, perfect. How does drought, does that happen to also contribute to the health of the boreal, and would the same amount of snow or water from the snowmelt and cut lines be impacted for more reclamation, which if there are other disturbances on the land that can be provided?
Okay, if I understand the question correctly, so in terms of drought, so I'm just rereading our question.
Oh, so this
okay,
question.
So,
yes.
Oh, sorry. So just to answer your question, Sherry, about the drought. So I think if I'm getting it correctly, like how it affects the health of the boreal forest compared to on cut lines and snowmelt or water from the snowmelt in terms of reclamation. In terms of reclamation, yeah, I'm not too sure how to answer that. But definitely it has an effect on microclimate, like on the cut line compared to the interior forest. If that answers your question. Okay.
Yes, that does. Perfect. All right, I'm just gonna check if there are any other questions. What kind of effects?
Okay, in terms of microclimate, so there usually is right on the edge, like in that unique transition zone, because it depends on the season, which is kind of touches on why I think it'd be great to do this sort of study on edge effects in all seasons in the boreal forest, because as we mentioned, it's such a complex environment. But in terms of what kind of effects for drought and so forth on the line, usually in the summer, from what I've noticed, it's with increased light and more vulnerable to wind and blowdown and so forth. It's sometimes a bit drier in the upland boreal forest compared to the interior forest, right? Where you have more of that, how can I say, regulatory kind of climate and microclimate. But for example, in peatlands or in wetter areas in the boreal forest, this might be the opposite. So you might get more of a increased humidity and wetness on the line compared to the interior forest. So I think it just depends where you are in the boreal forest. And I think that's why I think it's really important to specify like exactly where your sites are, what type of forest you're in, and so forth.
All right. Also, everyone, Danique's email address is in the chat. So it is danique@ualberta.ca if you do want to reach out for any further questions. All right. Well, If we don't have any more questions, thank you, Danique, so much for this wonderful presentation. Thank you, everyone else, for tuning in and for all of your questions and your attention and your time. A special appreciation to everyone. We look forward to reconnecting with you in future e-lecture sessions. And with that, we will close the session. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.